A cold morning on the east bank of the Berezina near Perici. By noon, Army Group Center's reconnaissance doctrine no longer worked. The reason fit inside a rolled camouflage net and a thin radio schedule, both weighed in grams but able to move core. Subscribe, new evidence first, World War II videos every day. Dawn on the 22nd of June, 1944, came low and cool over the pine edges west of Bobruisk. The drizzle was intermittent, the cloud base sat at under 1,000 meters, and the Berezina floodplain shone with standing water. At a rail siding near Zlobin, flat cars stood nose to tail under blacked-out lanterns. By first light, the trains were empty and the sidings looked idle. The old rule said major Soviet offensives announced themselves days in advance through heavy radio traffic, early artillery registration, and obvious staging near the best roads. That rule had held in 1941 around Smolensk, and often enough after. Luftflotte 6 had trained crews to read ground scars, canvas patterns, and assembly parks on photo mosaics. German signals companies, working with fixed antennas on the Minsk-Mogilev line, had grown used to pinning Soviet front headquarters nets within a margin of 10 to 20 kilometers. Divisional diaries in Army Group Center recorded a rhythm. Noise on the air, smoke on the horizon, then tanks. The expectation at Orsha and Mogilev in mid-June was simple and conservative. It broke because 4 separate mechanics were applied together and timed to the hour. Radio deception replaced the usual build-up hum with dummy nets that chattered from Bryansk toward Gomel, while the real assault net stayed dark or spoke in short bursts at night. Night rail moves shifted entire artillery divisions along single-track lines between midnight and 3 in the morning, then hid the trains in tree-covered loops by 4. Camouflage nets, not the ragged farm sacking of 1941, but factory-patterned burlap squares, dropped over gun pits and vehicle parks in layers measured in square tens of meters. Last-minute artillery reveals pulled barrels out of timber sheds only after the line of departure had already been taped. A measurement turned the surprise into mass. On the southern approach to Bobruisk, 1st Belarusian Front built an artillery density above 180 tubes per kilometer, across a sector a little over 6 kilometers wide. Range tables were pre-marked, timber-aiming stakes were buried flush, and forward observers held fire until 0 hour. The first ranging salvos were not heard at all on the previous day. The first sound many German outposts heard was the opening drum on the morning of the 24th of June. A unit after-action page from a Guards mortar brigade logged a ripple rate of close to 4 salvos per minute for the first 5 minutes, then a sustained 2 per minute to conserve rockets. Radio deception, in this setting, meant disciplined fiction on the air. Operators in rear areas sent routine traffic at set intervals, with call signs copied from earlier months, and allowed German direction finding to fix them where there were no armies. The where and when were pinned to the Bryansk-Gomel axis between the 15th and the 21st of June. The witness objects were decoded signal summaries captured after the war and retained in translated form, alongside German daily assessments from Fremde Heer Ost. The logistics detail that made this work was banal. Spare batteries and dry shelters, so the fake sets could transmit at stable power through damp nights. The limit was simple. If Luftwaffe reconnaissance flew below the cloud and saw empty roads, doubt would grow. The myth said, bad weather alone blinded the enemy. The evidence shows structured radio play created a false center of gravity. Night rail moves were the backbone. Between the 2nd and the 21st of June, front rail brigades pushed an average of over 50 echelons per night into the Gomel and Zlobin area, according to surviving ferry and rail manifests. The where was the Orsha-Gomel main line and the spur to Kalinkovici. The unit tags included railway troops of the 1st Belarusian Front and depot staff under the People's Commissariat of Railways. The metric was the window, roughly 3 hours of movement under full blackout, then shunting into wooded cuttings before first light. The constraint was the single-track choke and the soft shoulders after rain. One derailment could freeze the whole sequence. A maintenance card for a Class Sioux steam locomotive noted a midnight ashpan clean at a shielded pit east of Rachitsa, the kind of small act that kept the stream moving. Camouflage nets were no longer improvisation. Factory lots delivered patterned squares with leaf and branch tones printed to break straight lines under oblique sun. The where was a belt of pine on the east bank of the Berezina. The when was the week of the 17th to the 23rd of June. The measure was coverage, at least 3 layers over gun pits and 2 over vehicle lines, totaling several thousand square meters in a single divisional park. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken from over 2,000 meters missed these pits until the first shells spoke. The logistics vignette was training. Sappers ran short drills on tying, staking, and lifting nets in less than 5 minutes per pit. The limit was wind and wet fabric. Heavy rain sagged the weave and created unnatural dark patches. The myth said nets made armies invisible. Evidence shows nets only erased shape long enough to set the timing. Last-minute artillery reveals were the hinge. Batteries sat with barrels greased and wrapped, range cards sealed in oilskin, and trucks faced forward on exit tracks. The where was the southern shoulder of the Bobruisk Bulge. The when was the early hours of the 24th of June. The metric was minutes. Guns out of sheds and online within 15, first salvos within 20, fire plans shifting to rolling barrages by 40. Witness objects include range tables stamped with front-level stamps, unit after action reports, and captured German position sketches, later overprinted by Soviet artillery staffs. The limit was discipline. One premature breakout before dawn would have burned the entire plan. The myth said Soviet guns always pre-registered loudly. Evidence shows registration by map conversion, and sound ranging allowed silence until the clock struck. Terrain pressed on every choice. The Pripyat Marsh to the south, the Berezina's wet meadows, and the soft sand ridges east of Perichi all punished daylight movement. Cloud kept reconnaissance high, rain killed dust that could have marked columns. Road verges collapsed under repeated axle loads, so pioneer units laid brushwood in layers measured by the bundle to keep 2-ton trucks from sinking. The Germans expected the rails in the main road near Bobruisk to advertise the blow. Nothing did. The quiet contradiction at noon was plain in Army files. Luftflotte 6 photo interpreters filed mosaics with little activity. Army Group Center's daily note on the 20th of June had emphasized Orsha as the main hazard. Yet by the 24th, the Berezina crossings downstream of Bobruisk were under fire from formations that had seemed, on paper, far to the north. This was not accident or fog. It was paperwork, nets, trains, and radios arranged to erase an army for a day. Logistics and training vignette. A sapper battalion near Kalinkovici spent 2 nights rehearsing net lifts with blindfolds to meet blackout rules, averaging under 6 minutes per pit by the 3rd run. Terrain and conditions constraint. A steady wind gusted above 10 knots on the 23rd, forcing restaking of wide spans and doubling the rope count per net. Myth versus evidence. German staff notes later blamed partisan sabotage for rail illusions. Unit rail manifests and locomotive service cards show plane throughput raised by timetable slicing and night loops, not by ghost trains. The lever sat in Moscow under a green lampshade. General Alexei Antonov, Stavka's chief of the Operations Directorate, signed the Deception Annex for the summer offensive on the 12th of June, 1944. The document set call sign sets, dummy net locations, and the rule that real assault nets would hold silence outside short night windows. Countersignatures from Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky placed authority over fronts. The paper moved by courier to Minsk, Mogilev, and Gomel by the 14th. At front level, the name that mattered at Bobruisk was Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky of 1st Belarusian Front. His staff chief, a career planner accustomed to long rail tables and short nights, built the schedule that married trains, nets, and gun parks. On the 17th of June, he approved the camouflage allowance, enough factory nets to cover at least 2 army parks and all heavy batteries in the commitment sector. Training orders went to sapper brigades the same evening. A front instruction required that every gun pit include a pre-cut timber door to convert a shed into a firing bay within minutes. The order path looked simple on a stamp, but it crossed frictions. The first obstacle was rail capacity. The Orsha-Gomel line and the spur to Kalinkovici were single-track across stretches, with bridges still under repair from winter weather and partisan damage. Antonov's annex paired the deception nets with an operational instruction from the People's Commissariat of Railways. Cut freight consists into shorter night blocks between 10 and 20 cars, accept extra couplings, and push them in a 3-hour window. The price was wear on couplers and crew stamina. A maintenance card from a yard near Rachitsa shows a coupler pin change at 2 in the morning on the 19th of June, the kind of detail the annex assumed and depended on. The second obstacle was air reconnaissance. Luftflotte 6 could still put reconnaissance aircraft over the Berezina when the ceiling lifted. Vasilevsky's countersignature fixed the answer. Stacked deception, where the camera would most likely look. The dummy radio nets would chatter along the Bryansk-Gomel axis. The visible activity at daylight would sit near Orsha with decoy tanks, fuel drums, and straw parks. Aerial reconnaissance photos later recovered show straight lines and false parks in those areas, timed for cloud breaks around midday from the 18th to the 21st. The real parks remained under trees near Parichi and east of Zlobin. The third obstacle was doctrine inside the attacking army. Artillerists preferred to pre-register openly. Radio officers liked routine test calls. Railway managers liked daytime safety checks. Rokossovsky's staff wrote the rule in clear terms on the 19th of June. No daylight registration, no routine net tests, no daytime brake inspections inside the forward parks. Compliance meant retraining habits in days. Unit after action summaries from Guards mortar brigades note short rehearsal bursts by sound ranging only, with forward observers calibrating by map conversion and anemometer readings at dawn. Names anchored the Maskirovka pyramid. Antonov authorized the deception annex. Vasilevsky carried the authority across fronts. Rokossovsky and his staff imposed the local hard edges. On the German side, the daily assessments from Fremde Heere Ost, signed at the level of a general staff colonel, read the fake rhythm and passed it up to Army Group Center. Those summaries, captured later and preserved in translation, fixed the wait near Orsha through the 20th of June. The path of orders crossed the same rails as the guns, but moved faster and lighter. The decision point came when Rokossovsky chose to retain 2 thrusts on his Bobruisk axis, one north of the marsh and one south through the swampy ground toward the Parichi road. The safe choice under deception would have been a single, tidy blow where road and rail met. He argued for both and set the deception to hide the southern thrust where the marsh would seem to forbid it. On the 21st of June, his front instruction approved cutting new corduroy lanes under net cover across measured lengths of swamp, each lane staked every 10 meters and tested by 2-ton trucks. The commitment to 2 axes stretched nets, trucks, and trains, but it also multiplied the masking. A final human adjustment came from the artillery command. The front artillery chief accepted a last-minute reveal schedule that put the first heavy guns on the line less than 20 minutes before opening fire. That required dress rehearsals in darkness. A training vignette from a gun regiment near Kalinkovichi records a 3-night drill cycle. Pull out of sheds, slew to pre-marked bearings by compass and stake, lay on indexed range cards, fire blanks once, then shove back and recover, all in under 25 minutes. Crews logged bruises and broken fingers. Discipline replaced comfort. Dates mattered because silence had to be believed. Between the 15th and the 21st of June, dummy nets transmitted at regular intervals, each interval measured in minutes, with power levels steady enough to look like command posts. On the 19th, a weather report showed a likely cloud break late morning. The deception parks arranged straw and squared fuel drums into tank silhouettes in open meadows east of Orsha. On the 20th, Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed what it expected to see. On the 22nd, the Berezina belt stayed quiet and wet. Terrain pushed the decision toward night. The Berezina meadows were flooded in patches up to knee depth. The sand ridges near Parichi crumbled if too many axles hit the same spot in daylight. Night rail moves kept weight off the roads when the ground was weakest. The timetable allowed 3 hours between midnight and 3 for movement, then a hard stop to clear the lines and get crews under cover. The cost was sleep. A locomotive service sheet logged 3 crews swapping cabs in a single night to keep the steam up and the schedule honest. Myth and evidence again parted. The myth says the offensive surprised Army Group Center only because of partisan sabotage and June weather. Witness objects point elsewhere. Decoded signal summaries show dummy nets. Rail manifests show echelons sliced into short, dark blocks. Aerial mosaics show decoy parks placed under predictable cloud breaks. The surprise was planned in layers and signed by names. The rollout began with ink and ended with timber and grease. Antonov's signature on the 12th, Vasilevsky's countersign on the same day, Rokossovsky's front instruction on the 19th, and unit-level training orders on the 20th formed a chain. By the 22nd, the chain held. When the guns came out of sheds before dawn on the 24th, the old rule was already dead on paper. Maskirovka in this setting was a system, not a trick. It had parts that clicked together: radio deception nets, night rail moves, camouflage nets with trained handling, and last-minute artillery reveals backed by map-based registration. Each part had steps, limits, and a reliability measured in practice, not in slogans. The method lived in schedules, logs, and range cards. Witness objects survived because paper was how large armies remembered. Radio deception began with a call sign plan and a schedule. Staff officers assigned old familiar call signs to dummy stations and placed them in rear garrisons along lines the enemy watched, like Bryansk to Gomel. Operators then sent routine traffic at steady intervals, aiming for a cadence of roughly 40 messages per hour across a net during peak windows, each message short, using authentic brevity codes. Direction finding would fix them. That was the point. The reliability of this layer, judged from German daily assessments and later Soviet staff reviews, was above 8 in 10 when weather kept cameras high and when operators avoided chatter outside set windows. The limit showed when a reconnaissance flight slipped under cloud or when a dummy set's battery sagged, changing the signal strength in a way a skilled opponent could notice. Night rail moves were a timed choreography. Railway troops broke large echelons into blocks of 10 to 20 cars to match 3 hours of darkness and single-track gaps. Movement clocks ran from midnight to 3, with yard shunts finishing by 4 to clear lines before first light. Loads focused on guns, ammunition, bridging, and fuel. Ferry and rail manifests from the Orsha-Gomel corridor list over 50 blocks per night in the week before the opening. Reliability here was near 9 in 10 when switches were greased, crews rotated in time, and repair pits were shielded so maintenance could continue in blackout. The constraints were the bridge limits on the Dnieper approaches and soft shoulders after rain. One bogged wagon could hold a line for an hour. Camouflage nets were a material solution with trained technique. Factory-printed burlap squares, often 6 by 6 meters, were linked with jute ties over poles cut on site. Sappers learned to stake corners into wind, overlap seams, and avoid straight-line shadows. Coverage goals were expressed in square meters per battery, at least 2,000 for a heavy regiment park, layered to break vertical and horizontal lines. Aerial reconnaissance photos show the difference. Single-layer nets still printed a grid under noon sun, double and triple layers blurred into the forest floor from 2,000 meters. Reliability sat around 7 in 10 in rain and improved to 8 in 10 in dry overcast. Wind was the enemy. Gusts above 10 knots demanded restaking and more rope. Last-minute artillery reveals tied the system together. Batteries pre-cut timber doors and sheds, packed barrels in grease and cloth, and stored range tables with pre-converted firing data based on map coordinates and registered survey points. At the clock, trucks backed to doors, crews hauled tarps, laid guns by compass on stakes, and opened with full plans within 15 to 20 minutes. A Guards Mortar Brigade's unit after action page records ripple rates of 3 to 4 salvos per minute in the first 5 minutes, then a controlled 2 per minute. Reliability depended on rehearsal. 3 night cycles brought crews under the 20-minute target. 2 left them fumbling. The limit was human fatigue and the risk of a premature report from a careless sentry or a smoking truck. Witness objects anchor the method. Unit after action report pages describe the timings and the ripple rates. Aerial reconnaissance photos fix where nets worked and where they did not. Rail manifests count the night blocks and tie them to places: Zlobin, Kalinkovichi, and the loops east of Richitsa. Range tables and maintenance cards, stamped with front headquarters seals, show the pre-work that allowed silence. Map conversions done days in advance, wheel bearings greased for quiet, couplers inspected under hoods. 2 constraints ran through every step. Terrain demanded night, marsh water on the Berezina meadows, soft sand near Parichi, and clay shoulders along the Orsha line punished wait in daylight. Weather demanded discipline. Low cloud shielded movement but also hid mistakes until too late. Rain sagged nets. Wind tore ties. A logistics vignette sits in a small line on a locomotive service sheet, coal trimmed with shovels to reduce spark throw under blackout, because a single ember on a dark embankment could betray a line. Myth versus evidence needed a place in the method. The myth claims that Maskirovka was a single canvas thrown over armies. Evidence shows a clock and a ledger. Radio nets talked on time to be seen. Trains moved in small bites in set windows. Nets were raised and lowered to match sun angles. Guns came out only at the last viable minute. The method worked not because the enemy was blind, but because his eyes were pointed, by habit and by craft, at the wrong spot. Reliability numbers were not uniform. Radio deception performed best when Luftwaffe reconnaissance flew high, raising its effectiveness into the 8 and 10 band. Nets performed best in dry overcast, not in heavy rain, rising toward the 8 and 10 mark, then sliding when fabric sagged. Night rail kept to plan when crews were rotated at least every 2 hours. A log from the 19th of June shows 3 crews sharing 1 locomotive on a 4-hour cycle to keep hands steady. Artillery reveals succeeded when rehearsal cycles reached 3 nights. 2 nights left errors that cost minutes. The system also had a human floor. Operators grew sleepy near 3 in the morning, sappers cut fingers in wet rope, gun crews bruised shoulders in blind lifts. A training vignette from a sapper company near Kalinkovici notes a switch from bare hands to canvas gloves after 9 men suffered rope burns on the 20th of June. The small change shaved a minute from average net lifts. Maintenance cards show extra grease points on couplers and bearing caps to reduce noise. These entries are small, but they kept the clock true. A tease for field tests sits where the papers intersect reality. On the morning of the 24th of June near Bobruisk, the radio nets played the tune they had written. The rails fell quiet before dawn, the nets lay still enough despite wind, and the sheds opened on time. German daily assessments for Army Group Center, dated the 23rd and the 24th, placed weight near Orsha. The blow fell on the Berezina instead. Next come 3 places where the system met ground, weather, and an enemy with a plan of his own. The first field test unfolded north of the Divina Bends, where spruce edges and peat fields met at poor angles for tanks. On the 22nd of June, 1944, the 39th Army and the 5th Guards Tank Army pressed toward Vitebsk along roads that German engineers believed were the only viable lanes. The old rule said artillery registration and road dust would warn days ahead. Instead, radio deception nets along Orsha kept German direction finding busy, while night rail blocks delivered heavy guns into cover near Liozno. Camouflage nets layered in squares of 6 by 6 meters broke gun lines into forest texture, and last-minute reveals put barrels out less than 20 minutes before the first salvo. An aerial reconnaissance mosaic from Luftflotte 6, dated the 20th of June, fixed weight near Orsha. A unit after-action page from Ulfern Corps recorded encirclement within 72 hours. The second test lived under the white nights of Karelia, where night still offered hours of dimness, but never full dark. The Svir Petrozavodsk operation opened on the 21st of June, 1944, with the 7th Army crossing the Svir River on rafted bridges built under jute and burlap. Radio deception pulsed further west toward Olonets to suggest an Army pivot. Night rail blocks of 10 to 20 cars slid into masked sidings at Lodinoy Pole between midnight and 3. Camouflage nets sagged in damp air but still broke the geometry of pontoon parks enough to delay detection. Bridging logs note a first span over 400 meters assembled in under 60 minutes, while a Finnish position sketch shows fire plans that expected a narrower blow upstream. The third test ran in heat and dust between the Prut and the Dniester. In the second Jassy-Kishinev offensive beginning on the 20th of August, 1944, the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts masked their main thrust by talking on old nets near Tiraspol, while night rail moved artillery toward Fulchu and Hushi. Camouflage nets covered truck parks and vineyard belts. Last-minute reveals brought pistons to life and barrels onto line in darkness thick with insects and heat haze. A decoded Romanian signal summary placed reserves too far east, and by the 24th, the pocket west of Iași had tightened. production tallies from a front depot record ammunition expenditure that matched a compressed, sudden opening rather than a long, noisy prelude. Case 1 summary, tightened to the template. 39th Army at Vitebsk, on the 22nd of June, 1944, in Pine and Peat, radio deception near Orsha, night rail into Lyazno, nets in layers, reveals at 20 minutes. Measurable effect was an encirclement in roughly 72 hours. Witness object was an aerial mosaic misplacing weight. Case 2 summary. 7th Army at the Sphere, on the 21st of June, 1944, under white night haze. Radio deception at Olenets. Night rail to Lodinoy Pole, netted rafts, reveals as pontoons launched. Measurable effect was a bridge over 400 meters in under 60 minutes. Witness object was an engineer bridging ledger. Case 3. Summary. 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts at Iash on the 20th of August, 1944, in vineyard belts and dry gullies. Radio deception near Tiraspol. Night rail to Fulchu. Nets over trucks. Reveals in heat. Measurable effect was more than 100,000 prisoners within a week. Witness object was a decoded Romanian signal digest. Between these pins ran shared mechanics. Radio deception in all three built a false heartbeat on familiar call signs, at cadences close to 40 messages per hour in peak windows, and kept power levels steady so direction finding would settle. Night rail in all three trimmed echelons to blocks of 10 to 20 cars moved between midnight and 3 and cleared by 4. Nets, when dry, took wind with extra guy lines staked every 3 meters. When wet, crews doubled ties and lifted low edges to avoid unnatural shadows that cameras could catch. Last-minute reveals hit the same 20-minute target for heavy guns, with ripple rates of 3 to 4 per minute in opening minutes, then 2 to conserve ammunition. Logistics vignette, a railway yard at Lodinoy Pole, logged 3 coal trims with shovels in the small hours on the 19th of June to reduce spark throw under blackout. A maintenance card shows a bearing cap grease at 2 in the morning on the 20th. A ferry manifest lists 10 blocks in the night window, each under 20 cars. Terrain and conditions constraint. White nights compressed darkness in Karelia, enforced finer timing. River fog on the Sphere raised humidity that sagged nets. Wind gusts above 10 knots at Vitebsk demanded restaking every hour. Myth versus evidence. Later accounts credited weather alone for the surprise at Iashi. A decoded signal summary and aerial mosaics show deliberate misdirection on the air and decoy parks timed to predictable cloud breaks. At Vitebsk, German reconnaissance patrols on bicycles took side tracks into peat fields the day before opening fire. They did not find the gun parks because a sapper company had cut new corduroy lanes under canopy and lifted nets only at night to pass trucks. Range tables in oilskin sat under shed roofs with bearings pre-converted from maps at scales of 1 to 50,000. When the order hit, crews pulled doors, set elevation from cards, and fired inside 20 minutes. A unit after action report page from a Guards mortar unit logged sustained fire for over 15 minutes before shifting to a rolling barrage. At the Sphere, the engineering twist was the raft park. Pioneers floated bays under net skirts and only raised section flags at the last minute. Aerial photographs from high altitude saw river light and trees, not the geometry of a bridge under construction. Finnish observers reported engine noise late, but could not fix the span before artillery suppressed banks. The measurable effect was a crossing rate of hundreds of men and dozens of light vehicles per hour within the first hour, recorded in a regiment's crossing log. At Iashi, heat baked the day and hid smoke in low inversion layers. Romanian and German staff expected a blow near Tiraspol and held reserves east. Night rail built weight near Hushi and Fulchu, while dummy parks drew lenses. The last-minute reveals were timed for a dawn, when haze would keep cameras high and contrast poor. Aerial reconnaissance plots in Romanian files, later overprinted by Soviet staffs, show wrong arrows. Production tallies from depots list ammunition moved on nights of the 18th and 19th in tonnages, matched to a southward thrust, not to the east. Across all three, the measurable spine was time. 20-minute gun reveals, 3-hour night rail windows, 4 salvo opening bursts per minute, and crossings in under 60 minutes were not poster words, they were ledger marks. The reliability remained near 8 in 10 when operators kept schedules, crews rotated inside 2 hours, and nets had double ties. Failures came where a tired man lit a cigarette, where a net snagged and tore, or where a wagon bogged on a soft shoulder. These were noted on maintenance cards and incident lines in unit reports. Training vignette: a sapper platoon near Liozno practiced net lifts with blindfolds to meet blackout rules and cut average time from 8 minutes to under 6 by the third night. A rail crew near Hushi ran a 3-man rotation, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours on, to keep hands steady through a 4-night surge. An artillery regiment near the Sphere drilled bearing sloughs by compass and stake in silence until crews hit their marks without a single shouted word. The quiet labor shows in small handwriting on range tables and service sheets. The pattern traveled because it was transferable. A call sign schedule can be copied, a night window can be set on any single track, nets can be cut in any forest belt, sheds can be built from local timber. The case studies did not rely on rare devices, they relied on repetition, ledger discipline, and weather-read clocks. The effect at a brigade level and then at an army level came from many small acts held in time. Opponents adapted in the only ways available under pressure and short fuel. In Army Group Center, after the first week of Operation Bagration, staff emphasized dawn reconnaissance flights under cloud, bicycle, and horse patrols into forest verges, and short violent artillery probes to force Soviet guns to answer. Signals companies adjusted direction-finding routines to sample at irregular intervals so dummy nets could not predict the listen. Decoy recognition cards circulated, warning watch officers about squared fuel drums and straw lines laid in too neat a pattern. The countermeasures had logic, but they ran into the same limits Maskirovka exploited. The dawn flights needed fuel and clear strips. By the 25th of June, 1944, forward fields in Belarus were soft and pitted, and cloud bases stayed under 1,000 meters for long stretches. When a camera did get below cloud, the picture saw decoy parks near Orsha and rail sidings that had been cleared before first light. Aerial reconnaissance mosaics dated the 23rd and the 24th of June show the wrong clusters circled in grease pencil. Bicycle patrols into peat belts near Vitebsk bogged at the same soft shoulders that night rail had avoided, and mounted patrols in the Berezina meadows flooded at knee depth. Signals adaptations faced deception built on rhythm. Dummy nets used old call signs and sent at familiar cadences. German direction-finding officers tried irregular sampling, but they still found transmitters that looked and sounded like headquarters nodes. Decoded signal summaries recovered later show assessments that placed weight near Orsha through the 20th of June. The correction came late, only after ground observers reported bridge smoke on the Berezina. By then, artillery was already in place, and firing on a schedule cut to minutes. Limits on the Soviet side ran through every layer. Radio deception depended on batteries and disciplined clocks. One sagging voltage or a bored operator could flatten the illusion. Night rail depended on single-track lines and 3-hour windows. One derailment or a broken coupler could seize the spur. Camouflage nets depended on weather and wind. Heavy rain sagged burlap and created dark pools that an experienced interpreter could flag. Last-minute artillery reveals depended on rehearsals. 2 nights of practice produced fumbling and lost minutes, while 3 nights produced muscle memory. A hard limit appeared under white nights north of the Sphere. The sky never went fully dark, and humidity sagged nets and made ropes swell. Crews worked slower and needed more ties. Bridging logs show extra minutes squeezed into spans, and crossings shifted later into the pre-dawn dimness. Reliability slipped from 8 in 10 toward 7 in 10 in those conditions. A training vignette from a sapper company records switches to thicker gloves to handle wet rope, and a rule to rest crews every 2 hours, small steps that traded speed for endurance. Opponents also tried their own deception. Romanian and German staffs arrayed dummy guns and trucks near Tiraspol in late August 1944 to pull attention east. For a time, it worked on cameras, but it did not erase the night rail manifests that moved weight toward Hushi or the range tables pre-converted for bearings along the Prut. Soviet staff learned to read their own illusions against the ledger. If a decoy park lacked corresponding fuel tallies or rail entries, it was treated as noise. This was a refinement born in July and sharpened in August. Cross-check every visible cluster against the paper trail. Another refinement tightened net handling after storms. On the 23rd of June, near Parigi, wind gusts pulled stakes and lifted one edge of a large span, creating a straight-line shadow that a high camera might catch. The next day, front instructions added a rule to stake corners every 3 meters and double the lines where forecasts predicted gusts above 10 knots. Maintenance cards logged rope issuance and replacement counts. The adjustment shows a system flexible to weather, not a ritual immune to it. On the rail layer, a refinement in July spread loads across secondary loops to reduce pressure on main sidings where observers could expect to see dust and movement. Ferry and rail manifests show short blocks sent to lesser-known cuttings east of Rachica and south of Zlobin. A locomotive service sheet notes night ash cleanouts moved to shielded pits with wet sand to kill any ember under blackout. These small changes reduced the chance that one blockage would paralyze the schedule. Artillery practice refined too. Range tables for units near Bobruisk show added columns in late June for wind drift and humidity corrections calculated at dawn rather than day before. Forward observers logged anemometer readings at set minutes and relayed corrections on tight schedules. The method cut the need for noisy registration and kept the last-minute reveal clean. Discipline, again, was the hinge, not a gadget. Costs ran in parallel and did not vanish under praise. Crews went without sleep for nights, and errors grew after 2 a.m. A guard's cigarette could arc a red point in darkness, a driver's foot could slip under wet boards, nets tore, ropes frayed, and fingers split in cold rain. Rail wheels wore, couplers loosened, and bearing caps needed more grease than planners hoped. Production tallies show rope and burlap issuance rising through June, evidence of wear rather than planned reserves. Myth versus evidence in adaptation also needed clarity. The myth says German reconnaissance failed because of incompetence. Witness objects show fuel shortage, bad fields, and camera angles fighting planned illusion. The myth says Soviet nets alone erased armies. Papers show that without night rail and a clean last-minute reveal, nets would have been masks over empty stages. The spine was timing, not magic cloth. By late July 1944, both sides knew the outlines. German staffs warned against trusting single sources and pushed for more ground scouts and human reports. Soviet staffs doubled down on ledger discipline, fixing time windows and cross-checking visible parks against manifests and range tables. Refinements hardened into rules: no daylight brake checks in forward parks, stake nets at 3-meter intervals, run dummy nets at known cadences, and rehearse 3 nights before the clock. The contest did not stop. It narrowed. Outcomes showed in bridges fallen silent and roads suddenly busy. At Bobruisk on the Berezina, the immediate effect after the opening on the 24th of June, 1944, was a rupture that lifted by the hour. Army Group Center's doctrine of early warning by radio and photo no longer held. Artillery that had not been heard the day before cut lines and splintered positions. By the 29th, the pocket shrank and diaries fell to silence. Unit after action pages list prisoners in blocks and bridges taken by name, a cold ledger where surprise had done more than noise could have. On the Vitebsk-Orsha line, crossings that had seemed impossible under peat and pine became lanes that fed armies. The operational effect was tempo. Night rail timetables trimmed days off staging. Road verges that would have turned to paste under daylight loads stayed intact because heavy axles moved when ground was strongest. Travel time for heavy guns from depots near Zlobin to forward parks near Parigi compressed into single nights, measured in 3-hour windows, not into coarse day-long drags. Aerial mosaics in German files show empty roads at noon and full consequences by dusk. In Karelia, the sphere crossing held and widened into a road toward Petrozavodsk. Immediate logs show hundreds of men and dozens of light vehicles per hour in the first hours. Then, steadier flows once artillery suppression shifted to the far bank. The choice to lift pontoon flags at the last minute under net skirts meant that warning came as the crossing was already underway. Diaries in Finnish units show quick shifts to alternate fire plans and then pullbacks once bearings no longer matched what the banks showed. The White Knights had not saved the defense, because the method had met the light with discipline and clocks. In Romania, the Second Jassy-Kishinev offensive turned deception into collapse. Reserves held east on orders that matched dummy nets, not real blocks. Within days, the line bent and then broke, and by the 23rd of August, 1944, a government fell. Rail manifests in Soviet files show the quiet build toward Hushi and Folțiu. Decoded Romanian summaries show attention fixed elsewhere. The operational effect was a pocket formed at speed, with more than 100,000 prisoners within a week, a figure that appears in depot tallies and front summaries rather than in speeches. Witness objects carry the after. Unit after action report pages list times in tens of minutes, not broad claims. Aerial reconnaissance photos, circled in pencil, show the wrong meadows and the right result. Range tables bear greasy fingerprints from dawn corrections, evidence that the last-minute reveal was a habit, not an accident. Maintenance cards for locomotives list night grease and ash pit use in steady lines through June and July. Production tallies for burlap and rope swell in those same weeks. Paper matches ground. The operational rule that had broken stayed broken into the Vistula odor push. In January of 1945, fronts repeated the pattern along the Vistula, with night rail slicing echelons into 3-hour windows, dummy nets chattering along the Nereu, and last-minute reveals timed for snow haze. German staffs, thinner and shorter on fuel, could not restore the old comfort of early warning. The effect was travel time cut, bridges seized with limited pre-fire, and armored columns appearing where photo maps hinted at emptiness. The distance from depot to line shrank in hours, not in mere kilometers. Training hardened into doctrine. Maskirovka ceased to be a label and became a schedule inside staff notebooks. Radio silence and radio play had tables. Night rail had blocks and loops. Nets had staking rules. Last-minute reveals had rehearsal counts. New officers learned to read a weather report for cloud base and wind, and to translate that into rope counts and lift times. A logistics vignette from early January shows a sapper school running blindfold drills until lifts came under 6 minutes in snow. Doctrine lived in fingers and clocks. Myth and evidence diverged again in memory. The myth said that the enemy never saw anything because forests were deep and maps were bad. Evidence shows maps at 1 to 50,000 scales marked with stakes, call sign plans typed with care, and rail manifests counted in neat hand. When the enemy did see, he saw what he was meant to see: straw, squared drums, and chatter with old names. The lesson carried forward was not invisibility. It was priority control over what was visible and when. The long tail ran into the post-war years with changes in sensors and drills. Camouflage nets learned new dyes and denser weaves. Later decades added foil and then fiber mixes to break more than a camera's eye. Radio deception moved into disciplined emissions control and planned bursts tuned to adversary habits. Rail doctrine kept night windows for heavy shifts where geography and weather still made day a liability. Range tables gave way to firing computers, but the last-minute reveal lived on in movement-to-fire drills where guns came to line and shot within minutes. Abroad, others watched and wrote. Warsaw Pact manuals printed Maskirovka as a core principle, but the idea spread further into general staff schools beyond treaty lines. The rule that died on the Berezina, warning by open registration and lazy radio, stayed dead. In its place stood a new rule that a force could write an opponent's picture with clocks, nets, and trains if it held discipline. The cost remained: tired hands, worn rails, and the risk of a single small mistake opening a seam to a lens. Return to the map pin brings stillness. On the east bank of the Berezina near Parici, the meadows hold summer dragonflies, and the cut lanes through the pines fill with new growth. No drums speak. The rail loop near Zloben is quiet under moss. In a file room, a range table still smells of oil, a maintenance card still lists a grease point at 2 a.m, and an aerial mosaic still carries a wrong circle in soft pencil. The rule broke there, on a morning that began cool and ended with roads that no longer matched the enemy's map.